Hello and welcome to Seance, our Deathtrap tomb design stream here on the Adventure Archive. My name is Ryan, and as always, we have the master of Deathtrap dungeons himself, Sersa Victory. How you doing tonight, Sersa?
I'm hanging in there as always. How are you?
You know, I am waking up, but doing all right. So
Yeah, me too.
we'll see how we do. So so what's the plan for tonight? What are we doing?
So you and I will be continuing our process of collaboratively building a dungeon adventure on stream in the style of something like the Tomb of Horrors. In our last episode, we finished sort of laying the groundwork for our module by coming up with what we call dungeon crawl moments. We had a big list of moments that are iconic to the dungeon crawl play experience, and we used the elements that we came up with, like monsters, traps, puzzles, and treasure, to brainstorm ideas for interesting and engaging moments. So today we're going to start to really get some concrete stuff put down on paper. And tonight we are going to, 5 episodes in, actually start to make the dungeon map. Um, so before we dive into that, though, I wanted to ask you what your experience has been like as a GM creating maps for your adventures. Do you have a lot of experience doing that? And if so, what is your process for coming up with maps for layouts for your adventures?
So, um, when I've done or used a lot of map stuff in the past, I would often repurpose like maps are already made in some way, shape, or form. Either ones that came like with an adventure that I adapted, or there's some Patreons I follow that have a lot of just kind of like maps you could easily drop in. I mean, I used a lot of when we were playing in person. Um, what am I trying, like video maps, if you know what I mean? So like maps that were designed to fit onto like a 40-inch TV screen. So they were like
Yeah.
live that you would play. So I would adapt maps a lot more than making maps. When I have made maps, a lot of times I would go to like maybe like Don John or whatever, like a map generator, and then just keep hitting create until I found one that I relatively liked, and then I might go to something like Dungeon Draft or whatever and like use it kind of as a template for what I wanted to do. But the only
Yeah.
time that I've really sat down and dug through like building a map the way I wanted it to do is when we ran Victory Basic. So like little bit of like what we're probably gonna go over tonight, but generally what I would mostly do, especially with like 5e, is adapting more than building. So a lot more. I will say when we did Victory Basic, it was a lot more fun to build the map to what I wanted, I guess. So that's mostly what I've done.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned things like Don John, because that is a good segue into what I wanted to talk about tonight. So if you want to go ahead and throw us to the first slide of the jam board, we can get cooking on that.
Oh, I had the right one up.
Boom.
There we go.
There we go. So, like I said, I was glad that you mentioned Don John, a random dungeon map generator, because done in the other episodes of Seance, we're going to be using random generation, procedural generation, to come up with the ideas for our module. And as I said in the first episode, by having these sort of random elements, especially when you have random combinations of things that don't usually go together, that really, at least for me, helps inspire ideas that I might not have otherwise come up with, ideas that are sort of novel and unusual. That's the process I've been taking for my Dungeon 23 designs. Is almost all of it is procedurally generated. But one of the things that I want to talk about before we really get into this, and I want to get your thoughts on this as well, is I personally am not a huge lover of things like Don John or the random dungeon generation tables in the back of something like the Dungeon Master's Guide. And the reason for that is while it can be a fun solo activity, me and a buddy of mine before the pandemic would go out to a bar, we'd bring our Dungeon Crawl Classics books or our AD&D books and just roll up dungeons. It's a fun thing, and it can create, some interesting, unexpected, uh, layouts that can be fun. The issue is that it doesn't really necessarily get you to the kind of gameplay that you would want in a classic dungeon crawl. What I mean by that is the random generators typically, you roll, okay, it's a 30 by 15 room, it's got an exit to the north and the south, there's a trap in this room, there's two skeletons, and there's 50 gold pieces, right? And you repeat that process until you fill your graph paper up, and you might have some interesting things that come up, interesting combos, but there's nothing in the generator itself that is designed intentionally to help procedurally generate the kinds of interesting gameplay interactions that you would want, the kinds that we've talked about in previous episodes.
Right.
And what I want to do is jump to the next slide here, because I want to talk about this really excellent book, this collection of essays called Procedural Generation in Game Design. It's edited by Tanya Short and Tarn Adams. For those who are watching or listening, might recognize Tarn Adams as one of the co-creators of the game Dwarf Fortress. And in this book, there are a lot of really, really great essays on procedural generation and game design. Now, I came across this because, in addition to tabletop role-playing games, I also program roguelike games. And those are dungeon crawl, adventure games where the dungeon is procedurally generated each time. And a problem that's been long understood when making roguelikes is that, it can be a good starting point to throw down random rectangles and random corridors and just scatter monsters and treasure, but it leaves a lot to be desired. And you're really sort of hoping that the generation algorithm comes up with enough unusual, interesting things to keep the game interesting. And what I want to do here is I want to read from a passage very early in this book by one of the essays, talking about how this is a pretty well understood problem of, we're taking what they call the most naive approach to generation. So the author here, Kenny Backus, writes that a common pitfall for beginners to procedural generation is to think that procedural content, a replacement for content creation, is also a replacement for content design. So he continues, there's a faith that the system, due to the fact that even a naive one will create unexpected results, will create pleasantly surprising results of high quality. Again, even a naive system will create these infinitely. So the assumption is that there will be an infinite procession of pleasantly surprising content. Basically, what he means here is, well, I have a random generator, and people might say this about, the ones in the DMG or Donjon or whatever, algorithm you want to pick. It's, well, sometimes it comes up with interesting combos that you wouldn't expect. So that means it's sufficient, right? Well, according to this author, no, that's not correct. And I happen to agree with that. And he goes, the pitfall is born from two unspoken unknowns: an ignorance of what makes a game's design actually compelling, and an ignorance of the traits and requirements of content that will work best with that design. So basically what he's saying here, and this will kind of lead us into our exercise for tonight, is things like very basic, quote, naive dungeon generation tools like Donjon, or what you might find at the back of your favorite Dungeon Master's Guide. They are not created with the intention of creating the kinds of gameplay moments, experiences, interactions that we would want players to have. They simply exist to lay down the rectangles and the connecting paths and purely randomly scatter monsters and treasure across the dungeon. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to use a method of generating our dungeon layout that is inspired by the work of roguelike developers. And in particular, if you want to jump to the next slide, we're going to be using a process called cyclic dungeon generation. So this is the generation algorithm that was developed by a games researcher and game developer, Dr. Joris Dormans, who's been watching these streams, by the way. So if you're watching,
Uh-uh.
hello, and thank you for creating Cyclic Dungeon Generation. But you know, his approach came out of a similar need, which is how do I create procedurally generated dungeons that feel handcrafted, that feel like they were actually designed by a human being and have an interesting flow to them rather than being a purely random assortment of chambers, right?
Right.
And this screenshot here is from a YouTube channel I highly recommend called AI in Games, where they did a really, really interesting deep dive into the cyclic dungeon generation algorithm. But what we'll be doing tonight is using an adaptation that I wrote of this computer game generation algorithm for the tabletop. And basically, the way that cyclic dungeon generation works is that you compose together a dungeon's layout, kind of like a flow chart. And you do so by chaining together these different cycles. So it's these loops of dungeon chambers that, when you put them all together, creates an interesting non-linear play space. So if you want to jump to the next slide here, a question that I've seen a couple people ask about cyclic dungeon generation in the context of tabletop RPGs is, well, isn't this just Jaquang the dungeon, right? Is that a term a lot of people have heard it, and I see it having kind of a resurgence, but are you familiar with this term, Jaquang the dungeon?
So I'm familiar with the term, and it's one of those things where I was like, I feel like I should know what it means, so I'm not going to ask.
Sure. So it's named, of course, after Janelle Jaquays, who was a legendary dungeon designer, especially with Judges Guild. And what they were known for were these extremely non-linear dungeon spaces. And what made their approach so interesting, especially at the time, was that you really got a sense of exploration because there were so many different paths that you could take. And it also opened up a lot of strategic opportunities because in more old school type games, you're not really entering a space and then duking it out with monsters just in that space. You may retreat to an adjacent chamber or try to loop around and ambush the monsters. Like, it was a much more sort of holistic approach to overcoming challenges, and by having this looped sort of structure, you could open up a lot of interesting opportunities for the players to make their way around, to avoid monsters, to trick them, that sort of thing. Now, cyclic dungeon generation is in the same neighborhood as Jaquang the dungeon, but it's not 100% the same thing. And in fact, Dr. Dormans has an essay in the procedural generation book about cyclic dungeon generation, and he talks about getting inspiration from these sort of old school non-linear dungeons, right? But the difference with cyclic dungeon generation, and if you want to advance to the next slide, is that what it does is it encodes these interesting design patterns or gameplay flows into the cycles. So we're doing more than simply just creating looped paths that are otherwise completely random. Rather, what we're doing is we're pulling from a menu of very common dungeon flows, interactions, right? So I don't know if you can see it super well on the screen, but there are things like two alternative paths. So there's two paths through the dungeon. Down one path, it might be themed around monsters. Down another path, it might be themed around traps, and the players can choose which way they want to go. There's things like hidden shortcut, where maybe there's a long path to the goal, but there might be a hidden shortcut that lets them avoid a monster or a trap. Dramatic cycle, one of my favorites, where you can see the goal, but you can't get to it. You got to make your way around. And then you have that very rewarding moment of like, oh shit, we made our way around and now we're here. Lock and key, those sorts of things. So again, we're still kind of leaning on cycles of sort of looped pathways, non-linear pathways through the dungeon in the same way you would when you're Jaquang a dungeon. But what we're doing here is what the authors of the procedural generation book would invite us to do, which is we're not simply just throwing random rooms on a piece of graph paper, but rather we're going, what is it that makes our design work? What makes a fun dungeon? And then how can we design our random generation to actually create those things rather than hoping that every once in a while something interesting comes out of the random noise? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to get your thoughts on that, like either about, dungeon generation tools from like the DMG or Donjon, or I know that you and I have been talking about cyclic dungeon generation for a long time. And in fact, you were the person who pushed me to actually commit it to paper and get it out. But like when you first saw this idea, how did you react to it? What did you think about it?
I mean, it's just so I'm a process guy, right? This is kind of a roundabout answer to the question. Like, I like when things have process that makes sense. It's one of the reasons like absinthe is my favorite drink, because I get to like make it into the way that I like. It's why I straight razor shaved for a while, because like there's a process to putting it all together, and when it makes sense, it feels just like, I don't even know how to describe the feeling when you look at something and go, oh shit, this is the way to do that. The DMG is one of the worst books, the 5th edition DMG, for gaming ever written.
Here we go.
So
Ryan's 5e
we
corner.
all
I love it.
we all know that it's bad. Let me throw my command out there. I gotta add some too. But it's just not, it doesn't have good tools, right? So when I was using things like Donjon, something about the quote that you said earlier really stuck with me, because it sounded like the two things that you don't get are like an ignorance of like how it's supposed to work and an ignorance of like if it's good or not. So it kind of sounds like you don't know what you don't know, kind of,
Right.
you know what I mean? So I felt like
what he wrote here, an ignorance of what makes a game's design actually compelling, and an ignorance of the traits and requirements of content that will work best with that design. So basically, you don't really know what makes your game fun, and you don't
right,
know what it is about the elements. So in a case of like a dungeon crawl, like what is it about traps, monsters, puzzles, or a map that actually gets you to that fun that your game should
right.
have, right?
So, and that's why, like I said, like it feels like you don't know what you don't know. So when you use something like Donjon and use something else, a lot of times it feels like, okay, this looks cool. I'll figure it out. I'll adapt it, because you don't know that there is a better process or a way in which to have intent in the design, I think is the most important part for me. So when I first read your Cyclic Dungeon stuff, that is what stuck out to me. That's what clicked the light bulb on. That's when I was like, oh shit, like it's the intention in the design where you can, because you might hear someone say like, Decay the dungeon, put a loop in it or something like that. It's like, okay, I'll put a loop in it. Why am I putting a loop in it? Like, why am I having them come back to it? I haven't felt that I've found a lot of resources that tell me not only like what I can do, but also why I'm doing it. And that's what Cyclic Dungeon Generation did for me when I first saw it from you. Like the light bulb literally just flicked on, and I was like, not only is this an easy way to do it, but it explains why I'm doing it too and how I can do it most effectively. So that's what I would say about finally getting to this process that is so much fun to do, but also one of the parts of the fun is because it feels like it has a purpose and intent. So
Yeah, 100%. And like I mentioned, this is a pretty common topic of discussion in the roguelike world, because roguelikes are primarily defined by the procedurally generated dungeons. And the roguelikes that really stand out or make an impact are things like Unexplored, which is Dr. Dorman's game. There's other roguelikes like Brogue, which has had a similar reception, because it also really tried to sit down and go, okay, what can we do beyond simply putting down random rectangles and corridors? And so, the developer of Brogue, Brian Walker, took sort of a different approach that maybe we'll talk about in a future episode, but it's the same gist where it's like, okay, what is it that actually makes the dungeon crawl adventure fun? And then how can I tune my algorithm to deliberately design those things rather than hope that they emerge out of, this quote naive procedural generation approach. And that's something that in the introduction to procedural gen and game design that they talk about is that really the way that you'd want to do this, whether you're making tabletop game or a roguelike or even any kind of procedural content like procedural music or artwork or open worlds, whatever, planets for like a space game. You really want to sit down first and go, okay, what would a human, like a good human designer make, right? And then how can I create an algorithm that approximates that? And that's, one of the things that people say about Unexplored, the game that uses cyclic dungeon generation, is that it has, quote, a handcrafted feel. And that's kind of the holy grail sort of with roguelikes is like, oh, this feels like an actual person sat down and made this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Like where do the goblins shit kind of thing,
and that's where that's my goal with converting the cyclic dungeon generation algorithm from a computer game to a tabletop game, because I wanted a process where I could randomly or procedurally generate dungeon layouts. So you get the benefit of it's quick. You don't have to think about it too much. You get interesting, unexpected roles or combinations. You get the fun of procedural generation, but it still feels like a human being designed it to help create the kind of play experience that's fun for dungeon crawling. So, are there any final words you wanted to say about that before we jump into actually generating our layout?
Not really. I mean, listen, if you're one of the thousands of people that has downloaded this and used this since, you're welcome. That's all I'm saying.
Absolutely. All right, so why don't we slide on over to our blank grid here. And what we're going to do for the remainder of tonight's episode is actually start generating our dungeon. So I think I should have sent you the link, or you may have it already, to the Cyclic Dungeon Generation PDF.
Yes.
Awesome. So if I want to pull that up, so for those who might not be aware, I put together a free PDF explaining cyclic dungeon generation, and it also includes a process for how to use this for generating a dungeon for a tabletop game. It's not D&D specific; it's usable with any sort of fantasy RPG. It lays out 12 different cycles, 12 different little flow charts or patterns that we can use to create our dungeon layout. So I definitely recommend that's on my link tree. If you just do linktr.ee/Sersa Victory, I think if you just do like the exclamation point Sersa in the chat, it should pop up with the link. But yeah, it's totally free. It's gotten some pretty good feedback. It even gives a detailed example of how to put together a dungeon, and it includes a free little adventure, which I've run several times, and it's always been a big hit, even though it only took me an hour to put together because I used the process. So what we're going to do is we've got our cyclic dungeon generation PDF here. We've got our blank graph paper on the Jamboard. So what I want you to do for me, Ryan, is go ahead and scoop yourself up a D12, and we're going to roll our very first cycle.
Right. A die. 1d12. All right. I got an 8.
Interesting. All right. So on page 6 of the document, it's got the D12 table for the cycle types. And 8 is Monster Patrol. So that's an interesting one. So Monster Patrol, if we go up to, looks like page 4 at the bottom left there, a very powerful monster patrols a short circular path between the start and the goal. So in this case, the entrance to the dungeon and then the exit or the final area. Players moving through the start, goal, or any chambers in between must be careful to avoid the monster. There is likely something valuable in a chamber patrolled by the monster that the Dungeoneers must retrieve or manipulate. So essentially, because this is our first cycle, this represents the overall cycle of the dungeon. So I'm going to jump back over to our jam board and see if I can draw this well. All right, so I'm going to draw a square here, and that's going to be our dungeon entrance. And then over here is going to be our goal, so probably the final boss or things like that. And then let's see if I can draw. Let's do this. Okay. So we have basically a big, things in my way here, sorry. A big circular path. We have a big dungeon. The circular path, that was hideous. Let's try that again. Going from the start to the goal. So start, goal. And there's a monster, like a very powerful monster, that basically patrols the entire dungeon cycle, right? And the players are always going to be threatened by the potential appearance of this monster. So to give an example, in my Dungeon 23 January module, there's a part towards the end called the Lost Caves, and there is a giant purple worm ghoul that continually burrows through the caves. And this would be an example of a monster patrol where throughout the entire cycle of the dungeon, the players have to be constantly aware of where the purple worm is burrowing and try to avoid it when it comes around and try to gather up any useful items or clues while avoiding being swallowed by the monster. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first thing we need to pick is what's going to be our big scary monster that patrols the entire dungeon. So we've got a couple monsters we came up with in our notes in previous episodes. We've got our sarcophagus golem, which I do love patrolling golems, like in Mailed Fist. It was kind of the same
Oh
deal.
yeah, I love that one.
But what's your feeling?
Well, gosh, I think that's the one link I didn't open up. Where's the link to our notes? Did you send me the notes link?
I did not. Let me share that with you here. Yeah, here you go.
Right. So, zoom in a little bit on here. Yeah. Okay. So, I do really love the sarcophagus golem. I feel like, so we have the mouth. I feel like that obviously has to be a stationary monster. We're not having a wall with a mouth on it running around. I feel like the ghost specter is probably more location based. I feel like the spider, the lichen spider is more location based. The only thing with the sarcophagus golem was, were we planning on having it look like a sarcophagus and people try to like stick something in it, then it becomes looking like a golem? Or what was your thought with
I was picturing something like, let me see if I can find the picture of it. There was this monster from 3rd edition. It was like a grave golem that was pretty, like this. Here we go. Yes, exactly this. Let me copy image address here. Here we go. Oof, that's a big URL. See if that works for you, if you can bring that up on stream.
Oh yeah. Bring it down a little bit so the whole thing will fit on the stream here. Interesting. I really like that a lot. So a little different than what was in my mind, but this is better. So my thought at one point was potentially like have the players mistake it for something that they were supposed to put something in, and then it looks golem-y. But if it's something more like this, then I think this is a fucking perfect wandering monster. Um,
And that could
because
also be. Oh, sorry, go on.
no. Well, I mean, this is just very also with like the angel statue at the top. This is the very Sersa looking creature here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Well, I'm thinking too, and I know we're still kind of dialing in on the details, but returning the bones or finding the bones, like I like the idea of the sarcophagus being this dangerous patrolling monster that runs the circuit of the dungeon, but at some point the players will have to come back to it to replace the bones or get the bones. So that's always fun.
I do like having something where they will have to get something from it and or use it. So like, we're kind of playing around with this idea that in our dungeon, the charnel vault of the corroded goddess,
Mhm.
about putting bones back, and this kind of like dual pathways to do that through different like
Yeah,
NPCs. I know with, well, the one of the ideas we're kind of tossing around is potentially like the first player that dies taking their corpse back to one or the other of the NPCs, and that
yeah.
kind of like determines your pathway.
Hmm.
um I like the idea of maybe having like either overtly or secretly, maybe like not a third option, but maybe like a second shot, where like what if they put a player in here, so basically like give something to the golem or take something from the golem to trigger something else. I
Yeah,
really really like that idea. um
100%. So I've gone ahead and updated our little sketch of our map here. And again, to summarize, we basically have our dungeon entrance, we have our dungeon goal or exit, and there's this circuit through the dungeon. It's a big loop, and the sarcophagus patrols the entire loop of the dungeon. So one thing I want to be clear about too is that this is a flowchart, not necessarily a spatial map. So what you're seeing here on the screen, if you've got the Jamboard up, this doesn't mean that like our entrance will be on the left towards the west and then the exits, towards the east. Rather, it's just a flow chart, and eventually we will convert this flow chart into an actual map. And I don't know if you want to show on the cyclic dungeon generation PDF. There's that example process section, and on page 11, there's the map that I drew using the example cycles, and you can see here how like it gets translated into an actual layout.
yeah, I love this. This is one thing that I think, um maybe if there's any part of the process I think that people might struggle a tiny bit the first time they do it, this might be it. It's that, as you just said, this is the loop and the circles are flow sheets, not it's not location wise, so it
Yeah,
can be anywhere you want. The loop just kind of gives you an idea of what should be in a general area, not exactly where it's supposed to be. So putting the flowchart down and actually writing on it a lot, I think, is super helpful, because it's supposed to be more of a guide to what is places, not necessarily where, based on the actual physical drawing of a circle.
yeah, 100%. It's meant to be, a flow chart to help illustrate the ways in which the players can move through the dungeon. All right, so one of the things that people may have noticed on the cycle diagrams, if you jump back up to page 4, is that there are these diamonds along the flowchart, along the arrows. Now, these are insertion points. So the way that we continue to build onto our cyclically generated dungeon is we generate our overall loop here. We pick an insertion point, one of these diamonds, and we roll another cycle and we insert the cycle right into that spot there. So we're essentially nesting cycles into our dungeon to create an interesting nonlinear space that feels like there's a flow, there's a purpose to it. For tonight, we're only going to do 3. That's kind of what I feel like is the sweet spot. It typically generates dungeons that, in my experience, take about 3 sessions to complete. But you can go pretty hog wild. I remember seeing some people on Twitter that were doing like their entire month of Dungeon 23 using this process and nesting what must have been like 15, 20 cycles.
Yeah.
It was pretty wild. There's some cool diagrams, but for this, I feel like 2 or 3.
Yeah, I know Christian Sorrell, who if anyone listening here hasn't listened to checked out Meat Castle Gameware, Christian Sorrell is a great creator, a really solid editor. I know I saw him on Twitter using a lot of the Cyclic Dungeon stuff and really singing its praises, and it's just it's cool to see. Not only do we know the process works and it's awesome, but it's also really cool to also see someone who downloaded it and is using it and doing really cool stuff with it as another cool reference point for people to go check out. So definitely look at the Twitter thread from Meat Castle for their Dungeon 23 to see this in action. Really well done. So
Oh, totally. And there's a couple other people who have been doing blog posts showing their process. And so if there's anybody who really wants to know more and has read through my ebook and still wants some more examples, definitely hit me up in the Adventure Archive Discord, and I'll share those links with you because it's really helpful to see examples. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and pick one of our insertion points. Let's go ahead and just grab the top one here. And you want to have somebody in chat roll a d12 for us to determine our next cycle?
yeah, whoever does exclamation point D12 first will use that as our next cycle here. Boom. We got Matev here, rolled a 10.
All right, so cycle 10, ooh, one of my favorites, false goal. So that'll be up on page,
I think
page
it's right
4,
next
right
to.
across.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, this is one of my all-time favorites. So the Dungeoneers are presented with a short path to what initially appears to be the goal. However, it is revealed that this, quote, goal is a trap or trick, and that the true goal lies at the end of a longer path that extends from the false goal chamber or a chamber nearby. So basically, what this means is, if you want to kind of talk it out in sort of a narrative way, is that we have this wing of the dungeon, and there's something that we want in this wing of the dungeon. It could be a key item that we use to get to the final boss. It could be a powerful treasure that is useful, like a magic weapon, or it could just be the way further into the dungeon, right? The goal can be a lot of different things. It's just anything that the players need to complete the dungeon. And in this case, the players are humming along, and pretty quickly, they come to what they think is the goal. Like, we found the key already. Well, it turns out it's a trick or a trap, and that actually the true, key or magic item or escape path or whatever is down a much further path. So there's actually an example of this in this cyclic dungeon generation document. And the way that the example adventure is set up is that there's 2 keys the players have to find, a scepter and a crown that the Dusk Queen had. And down the false goal path of the dungeon, they pretty much immediately come to what they think is the crown of the Dusk Queen. They need that to open up her tomb. They grab it. It turns out it's just painted wood. And that's when 2 carrion crawlers drop down and start, paralyzing players left and right. And in reality, the real crown is behind a secret door nearby. And the players go through there and follow a little bit of a longer path. They fight a basilisk in there. And that's where the real crown is, right? So that's what we've rolled for this. And I'm hoping that as we're going through this, people are getting a better sense of what I mean by, we're encoding these gameplay patterns into the dungeon, right? We're still randomly, creating the layout, but what we're doing here is, rather than just putting down rectangles and corridors, we're randomly plucking from this menu different little gameplay moments, little gameplay flows or interactions that, when combined together, create a very engaging dungeon adventure. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're a little under the weather
So
tonight, it's a little slow. So what we'll do here is we're basically going to insert uh, this false goal cycle into this branch of the dungeon.
So my idea, the thing that immediately popped into my head was, all right, we're trying to get these players to return these bones. My thought, how many sets of bones are we trying to return? Because I feel like that's going to really determine how big of an adventure we're writing, right?
Yeah. So probably because we're going to just be doing like 3 loops here, 3 cycles, you might just stick to one
For tonight or just in general?
in general.
Oh, so you're saying like they just get to one sarcophagus and return all the bones in like one shot?
Yeah, potentially, because we'll probably end up with about maybe 16 rooms total.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Um all right. That changes what I was thinking a little bit. I was thinking more of like 3 or 4 where they would have to drop off different bones in different locations, or like a lower extremity bone, an upper extremity bone, like a skull thing or something like that. Or maybe even like realize they have to put the last one into the sarcophagolum or something like that.
Yeah.
But so then one of my first thoughts with this false goal idea is kind of to have the first kind of crypt or like sarcophagus that they're supposed to, they know they're supposed to find a sarcophagus and return bones, and they find like maybe like a rundown dusty old one and go, I guess this must be it. And then I know we have something in our notes here. Let me drop this for a second. We have a thing in our notes here pretty early where we talked about potential for sarcophagus column plus metal shards. I don't know if we turn that into sarcophagolum or not, but there's another one I think we did a little bit later with like skeletons and stuff where maybe they find this sarcophagus. It's a trap, it dissolves or something pops out of it, and they realize this isn't the one they're looking for, and maybe eventually when they do get to one they're looking for, it's like more ornate and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's what popped into my head immediately, was just they think they found where they're supposed to put the bones, they realize that's not where they're supposed to put the bones, and then they find the place later to put the bones.
Yeah. I mean, I like that. We can definitely kind of work with that and finesse it as we go. So I'm going to do here, I'm going to draw our loop here. Let me do this. So one of the things that's backwards. One of the things that we can do with the false goal is put the true goal behind a secret, right? It's not required, but it's something that I enjoy doing. So I'm going to call an audible and go ahead and do it. So what I'm picturing here is we have this one wing of the dungeon. The players make their way through. There's a chamber here. This is the start of the cycle. We'll figure out what's there in a second. There is a short path, and it's like, oh, here's the sarcophagus that we're supposed to put the bones in. That's fun. But it turns out it's a trap. And actually, this may be, we might even say that this is what activates the patrolling sarcophagolum, right?
Ooh, it's a possibility. Yeah, it depends on how early. Yeah.
Because it'll be like probably 2 to 3 rooms away from the start, right? It'll be pretty close.
Right.
But we
so
always...
here's an interesting thought. Okay, so my thought has always been like multiple high priests, not like one high priest, like of the corroded goddess. Maybe, I mean, that can change, whatever. So what if, because I was thinking multiple rooms, but what if it's multiple sarcophagi in sarcophaguses in one room, right? So maybe just spitballing here, maybe they realize they have to put the bones into one of the sarcophaguses, and maybe there are technically potentially like the idea of multiple sarcophagolum, but the first bone that they put in awakens that sarcophagolum, right?
Yeah.
And then that triggers that sarcophagus golem to like rise up and go around. They realize this is not the right sarcophagus room or whatever, and then they'll have to go, find it later. Maybe that will trigger a need to come back and get that bone later, or they lose that bone's like power or whatever, because we talked about the bones giving them little powers. Basically, that power could activate the sarcophagus golem, and now they have less powers throughout the rest of the dungeon, since they lost that and actually turned on a monster with it.
Yeah, I like it.
Well, I like the idea that it like that's what triggers the start of the wandering monster. I guess my question with that is, what would the sarcophagus golem at that point try to fight them, or would it just like get up and start like doing its thing?
I mean, I imagine it'd probably start trying to wail on the players, and the players would be encouraged to flee because the sarcophagus golem would be so powerful that
that's
fight would be so obvious that they would lose, and then they would run away, and then the sarcophagus golem would default to its patrol pattern and basically become this sort of this pressure unit, right? Because that's the way the purple worm kind of functions in my Dungeon 23 thing, where essentially as a GM, you can always, if the players are lollygagging around, you can be like, okay, well, you start to hear the heavy thudding footsteps of the sarcophagus golem, or you can make a wandering monster roll. You know what I mean?
I love that, yeah.
And it also forces some interesting movement considerations, because if it's always moving in, let's say it's always going clockwise, let's say the players are down this wing and they need to make their way back towards the goal, they're going to cross paths with the golem. So they need to go, okay, what is between us and the goal that we could potentially do to evade or jam up the golem, so that way it doesn't immediately obliterate us when we go by.
Yeah. I like the idea. Some people in chat threw this out there, and I think we've talked about this before, about maybe potentially whether it's with the bone mechanic or not, like, and depending on like the pathway that they choose, potentially be like powering up the BBEG at the end, or giving themselves power to help themselves at the end. And I'm curious, this might be like almost apart from that potentially, in that the power of the bone, instead of going where it was quote unquote supposed to go, it activated the sarcophagus golem. So it's almost like taking a piece out of the game to an extent, as far as like their conflict with the BBEG, as opposed to like powering it up or something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love it. I'm a big fan of having players that screw up earlier in the module, having that screw up do something to make the final encounter more perilous.
I like that a lot.
So I'm all about that. So good call, chat. So you'll notice here I put some squares, some blank squares. We do have our path here. I'm using my cursor, but like the false goal start, that's sort of, we'll populate that in a minute. We have our fake goal, which I'm going to go ahead and just put in brackets, the fake sarcophagus. I can't type awaken goal ? So we'll do that. And then, we have the end of the cycle. So the start and the end are just rooms. We'll populate those in a little bit. And then in the cyclic dungeon document, it talks about how there's a long path to the real goal. So what that means is that it's 2 to 3 rooms long. So in this case, there's a secret door here, and then there's some interstitial room here, probably some challenge, and then the room that has the true sarcophagus that we're looking for. Does that make sense?
It does, but so my curiosity with that is, if the true goal of the dungeon is this early in the dungeon, like how are we going to build that towards like the big bad evil guy, right? Like if they do get all of the bones, if the whole goal is to get the bones into the sarcophaguses, and we're talking about 16 rooms, we're talking about maybe like 4 or 5 rooms so far. How do we make it so that they aren't just accomplishing the task like a quarter of the way into the dungeon? Or is there something we can do where like they find it, but they might not necessarily be able to like use it right now or something. Like, how
That'd
would
be my
you?
feeling.
Yeah.
Would be to have basically um, whatever thing is here in the goal. That's basically um, prerequisite, right?
Hmm.
So this you can imagine it like whatever's in this goal chamber here, that's what's needed to actually use the sarcophagus or potentially sarcophagi. I mean, what we might do is if you want to do the multiple bone set idea, is that we have I'm just gonna use a cross here, but like sarcophagus A as the goal, and then we're gonna have another goal on this wing here. Maybe the goal for that is sarcophagus B, right?
See, that was my kind of idea to
Yeah,
begin.
there we
If we're
go.
doing like multiple loops, we could have like almost like a goal at the end of each loop with like a final goal at the end, where maybe even like when you put the bone in, it gives you something else, and once you have all
Yeah,
of those things, you can open the final door, kind of thing, or something.
exactly.
So, and then that would make
I
more
like it.
sense in this room because there would only be one sarcophagus. You stick the bone in, realize that you awaken the sarcophagus golem instead of actually finding the real goal. A couple rooms later, you found the real goal, and then that can, or even so, here's also a potential idea. What if it's something like they stick the bone in and the sarcophagus like either sinks into the floor or like awakens the priest inside and they like float away. Like in some way, shape, or form, every time that they're able to awaken one of these high priests, when they get to the BBEG, the high priests are like lesser baddies in that encounter that you
Yeah,
have to like work past or are in like the antechamber to the big room. So basically you awakened them thinking that you were doing the good thing and then realized potentially that you were like, oops, like we made things harder on ourselves.
100%.
Okay. Cool. 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 Cool.
Awesome. I
Cool.
like
Cool.
it.
Cool.
Feeling good about
Cool. Cool.
that.
Cool. Cool. Yeah.
All right, so why don't we get um, somebody else in the chat to roll another D12 for us so that we can create our cycle for the second wing of the dungeon.
Right. Let's go for it. Someone besides Matev, I think you rolled the first one. Roll that. Just hit exclamation point D12, and we'll pick another cycle here. See, this is another thing though that, like, again, that has been really enjoyable through the process is that there's so much setup that once we do start mapping, the sarcophagulum felt like the right move in here. Like it was already here. It was already something that we had developed through multiple days because sarcophagus wasn't like the first thing we came up with. We rolled like we rolled things to get to the sarcophagus. Then as soon as we started mapping, one of these things fit right in, and I think not only you, me, but everyone in chat was like, "Oh, sarcophagus feels like the right spot here." Like it just feels cool to like have done all the pre-work for it, and now it almost feels like slotting stuff in. It's just so well set up. So I think Zero rolled the first one here, and they rolled a 5.
5. What do we got for 5? So we go on
Let's see.
down. Ooh, another one of my favorites. So that is the foreshadowing loop. So that'll be on page 3 on the top right. So in the foreshadowing loop, the Dungeoneers are teased with a view of the goal from the start chamber, the start of that loop, or a chamber near the start of the loop. However, the Dungeoneers are unable to reach the goal from that first chamber. A long path loops around, eventually leading to the Dungeoneers to that goal. So it's kind of funny because this is almost identical to the structure of the example dungeon in this PDF.
Mm-hmm.
This also has a foreshadowing loop, and the way this one works is the players step into the wing of the dungeon and they see through a portcullis the scepter that they need. So the first wing was the crown, this one is the scepter, but the portcullis, not only is it rusted completely shut, but it is covered in like instantly fatal yellow mold. And the players have to make their way around through like a broken down wall and open up a sarcophagus and climb through a hidden little crawl in the bottom. And eventually they make their way around to the room that they could see from the beginning but couldn't get to, and you have that moment of like, oh, cool, like this is, we're around to the spot that we couldn't get to. And I think we had something like that in the Victory Basic dungeon that you had designed
Yes.
for the stream.
Yeah, there was that literally was like that was one of the things is there is a portcullis, and I very like, I decided to make sure that the thing that they pulled open it wasn't in view because I knew fucking Hunter would use Mage Hand or something like that, so I wanted it around a corner. But that was they it was pretty early on. I think there was like some non-combat rooms to just kind of get the feel in the beginning. There was one little combat room, and then there was like a big room where I can't remember what it was on the in the Victory Basic thing that like fleshed out the room, but like there were actually like think kobolds fighting goblins or something in that. And you kind of like they put themselves in the middle of it, and that was a super fun room that had like the flame thing we were talking about before. But there was a portcullis in the far left, and that was like in the very like that was like the first third of the dungeon, and they had to go through at least a whole nother third to get back to that portcullis so that they could open it from the other side.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it is interesting that the
like closed loop,
oh
which
yeah,
was one of the moments
it is.
on our previous episode.
Yep, the moments are so, like it's all good. Everyone, listen to all of this. It is interesting that there is both a false goal loop and a foreshadow loop right on in the example dungeon. So, yeah. Good example.
Exactly right. So what I'm doing here, I'm back at the jam board. We have our second wing here of the dungeon. So here's the start. There's the end of this loop. This will be the goal that you can see, and we have a long path, so we make that 1. Why don't we do 3? Oops. That was weird. 2, 3. So it'll kind of go a little something like from there to there to there, here. We could do a little jaquazing, right? And we can say, all right, these connect, right? And that's something that you'll see if you read the doc, is that when you start to really draw out the physical rooms of the dungeon, feel free to add connections and additional loops, provided the overall structure remains intact. And then, actually, why don't we do like that? And here's this. Here's our second sarcophagus, so sarcophagus B. And then from here, there's a sight line. So the players can actually see the second sarcophagus that they're looking for, but they can't get to it, and they're going to have to go around through this wing to reach it. So, of course, one of the questions that we have to ask is, what is it that's keeping the players from getting across? And there's a lot of different options. We have, the obvious ones are like, okay, it's a portcullis you can see through. I've used in my Dungeon 23 module, like magical walls of force you can't get through. Chasms are a good one, particularly at lower levels when player characters can't really fly. And I also want to encourage us to look to our theme, right? So what would be a hazard that blocks passage, the players can see through or across it, but also fits the theme of our tomb plus corrosion?
Well, we have from episode 3 a this expose / weathering plus foreshadow later situation, right? I don't know if that's going to fit here, but this is when they have to use the wax to get through that area. So it's like literally impossible for them to get through. So what if they, I guess, like, we could have that space be in the way potentially, and then they have to like loop around later to do the ritual that's going to give them like the wax or something like that, and then like come back to be able to actually go through that area to go down. I think that's a possibility that ties in some of the like the stuff. I don't know.
So my feeling would be to maybe put something like that here.
Let me switch back to it. Yeah.
um, as sort of the last chamber between the players and the second sarcophagus, because this little like sight line here needs to be a pretty hard like barrier.
Oh,
Right?
I was backwards. Don't listen to me. I see what you're doing. You're right. Yeah, because I mean, the only way that you could really like do that where you couldn't really do it was to almost be, like have it on like a bridge or something. You know what I mean? Where you would
Yeah.
like, and that just feels like no one would fucking build that. You know what I mean?
I don't give a shit.
Oh well, you know the other potential, and I do like. I think regardless, I do like putting it as the last room first. But what jumped into my head is almost like a like oh my god, why am I blanking? It's where there's the kid and there's the guy who loses his horse in the quicksand, and he has to like, you know, when there's like a canyon and there's these two statues, and if you show any fear, the statues are going to zap you. It's like a fantasy movie from when we were kids.
I have no idea.
Atreyu, is that a person that's in the movie?
Is that a band?
Neverending Story. So,
Oh, okay. I've never seen that, honestly.
oh my god, it's amazing. Please watch it. Your heart will hurt. I feel so bad. The horse, my boy Atreyu. But anyway, there's a part in it where basically there's this like area you have to cross, and there's these two giant, like almost like sphinx like statues, if I remember correctly. And basically I can't remember what the whole thing is, but like if you look to the side or if you show any fear in your heart or something like that, like they will literally like zap you out of existence, like you will die. So that what triggered in my head a little bit was like, what if it is at the end of a bridge, but that's like that the statue that's having the corroded things, aura covers the bridge, so you literally have to like cross the bridge. But I don't really like that. That was a big tangent to get back to. That's probably not the best place to put that. But
So my first thought usually when coming up with like a barrier like this is a natural hazard. I feel like this is a pretty good place for those kinds of things. And so I'm thinking, you know, for the sake of time tonight, maybe go with an easy option, which is a chasm, right?
mhm,
And the roguelike Brogue and Unexplored, the game from which Cyclic Dungeon Generation was adapted, uses a lot of like chasms and lakes to allow you to see across. So what I'm picturing, I'm gonna try to maybe draw it here in the top right corner. But there's sort of like it's sort of like a cave, and then there's an actual worked section, but like the cave, the walls have kind of fallen away, right?
mhm,
And so this is like out open to like a cave or a chasm, right?
mhm,
But this is the actual room, and then here's like the way further into the dungeon, right? And then the
right,
sarcophagus might be like on a tier, and it's really obvious and decorated. But because like the walls have sort of fallen away, you know, like the room is partially exposed to the cave, right? And then the
mhm,
players, you know, there might be a similar thing where either there's a balcony, or maybe there's just like the wall is cracked, right? And they can sort of peer out and they see, oh, hey, I can see through the cracked wall. It's just like cave and cliffs out here in the darkness, but way beyond, I can spy a peek at this, you know, this chamber across the chasm. Does that make sense?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm very bad
um
at spatial, like describing direct. Like I can't give directions. People are like, "Hey, how do you get to Pizza Hut?" I'm like, I don't know. You know, don't ask me. Take a million lefts. Um,
So I think my mind immediately went like too hard on that, trying to use some stuff as opposed to just being like, just put something in the way. Let's just put something in the way. I do
yeah,
like though, like if so we do to bring it back a little bit too. We have this like water ashes plus water erosion is one of the things that
yeah.
we so there could be some type of part of this. Like what if this also descends? Like
Like it.
this loop would actually, so that if this is kind of like a cliff with like potentially a water source or something running through, we talked at one point about having these like ashes and water erosion like coming down through like the ceiling to make these,
Oh, there we
you know,
go.
stalactites or something. That could be a
Yeah.
room beneath that kind of area where you see the water kind of maybe at the base of this like eroded cliff thing, and the as we loop down to get at the sarcophagus, the water is dripping through, and that would allow us to have like the water erosion section, and also potentially a place to throw in those like the like lichen spider things, because that would be like a moist
Oh,
area.
hell yes, dude.
So I like the idea of maybe like that body of water, and then we're actually almost going underneath it as we loop down to the sarcophagus.
The myconid spider. See, you're getting it. Yeah, it's that's just grabbing those elements that we've used and just adding a little bit of juice. So instead of, okay, it's not just a cave in, it's not just a chasm, it's, you know, erosion dripping down through ashes, and the chasm itself might be filled with, you know, like a million urns or something, right?
Yeah.
It's
I
like a
definitely
really kind
think
of
that.
folding.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I really love the idea too of like we talked about like ash and erosion and all that kind of stuff. Like if the water itself is clearly not water, it's either like filled with ash, which would like potentially make it poisonous. Like it's not like they could just like swim across. And I think that it
Right.
would be like the water would be lower anyway for two reasons. One, so they
Yeah,
can't just like dive into it and try to swim across, but also
that's right.
two, because the water's been dripping down into the below, and the water level might actually be like over a great period of time like decreasing as it's been eroding through into the area we're going to get to later.
Yeah.
Look at us. Look at
I'll
us.
draw like a little diagram here. There we go. Cave wall, cave, and then our. There we go. Yeah, we're doing it.
Okay.
Awesome.
Perfect. Okay.
So what
And then
we've
we
done
can
here.
populate what's all going to go in there after, but I like the idea of like the loop. So yeah, so what have we done
Yeah.
here?
So we've basically created the high level flow chart of our dungeon. And so what I usually like to do is, and there's an example of this in the PDF, is talk it out as if it were like a story, like a narrative, because that can
Mhm.
help cement how the dungeon will feel when you play it. So if I were to do this, like, okay, we have our dungeon here. It is a big circuit
Mhm.
and a very powerful, you know, almost indestructible monster, a sarcophagolem, patrols the entire dungeon circuit and forces the players to avoid it when it comes around, and adds a time pressure. Down one wing of the dungeon, there is a room, and pretty soon after that, they come across what they think is the first sarcophagus they're looking for. Turns out it's a fake, and that the real sarcophagus lies behind a secret. And then down the second wing of the dungeon, the players pretty quickly come to a crack in the wall. They peer out across this like ash lake, and they can see beyond there is an eroded section of wall, revealing a small chamber very, very far away that has the second sarcophagus they're looking for, but they can't get to it. And after making their way through several challenges, they finally loop back around, get to the second sarcophagus, and then that will allow them to eventually go back to the end, do whatever needed to do, and fight the boss, right?
Mhm.
So what we've done is, you know, we've used randomness, or we've used procedural generation here. But my hope, and I want to see how you're feeling after this first step here, that it's clear what I meant by the generation is not just slamming random rectangles down. We've created a flow, right? An
Right.
interesting dungeon space that has a sense of purpose. Like even though this was randomly rolled, you could probably imagine a human designing a dungeon like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to pause here and see if there's any questions in the chat, or hopefully people are feeling like so far it's useful. Um,
Yeah. I mean, people have been kind of asking some questions as we go, but I think some of it has been objective. One of the things that Zero asked though, or stated, is that they can see that it could, like, the concept of they can see it but not reach it might become harder as the players are higher level depending on the system. Because, you know,
No,
I can see, you know, 5th edition, someone be like, I cast Fly, and I just, boop, I'm there, you know, or I cast Dimension Door, or like whatever. You know, and, you know, here's the thing. It's really, my thought immediately is depends on the system, right? If it's 5e and you're telling a story and you don't want the players to do that, try to figure out a way to stop them, right? But one of the reasons I don't play 5e is because I want the players to do what they want to do. If they somehow figure out a way to just like get around a thing, then oh well, like that is, the world is not balanced to them or your story, it just exists. And if they figure out a way around it, then they figured out a way around it. Good job. What are your thoughts on that?
yeah, I mean, my usual approach, I don't play a great deal of like super high level, super powered RPGs.
Right.
Um, but if you are doing something where players are going to be able to start teleporting and flying and that kind of thing, um, what I like to, what I don't like to, oops, sorry, what I don't like to do is purely shut it down. Rather, you just make that option risky, right?
Right.
So in this case, let's say the players could fly, right? So rather than trying to come up with some goofy contrivance, like, well, actually, you can't fly because of reasons, right? Um, you say, okay, you know, it's this is essentially going to be a uh, a very, very dangerous choice for you to fly. You could, and in fact, what that was when I ran through the Tomb Under the Tree, which is the example dungeon in the cyclic Dungeon Generation PDF. I actually had one group short circuit the loop by trying to. They found a scroll of Fireball. It was one use, and they said, you know what, we're just gonna go for it. And they used their one use Fireball on the portcullis, and I was like, okay, yeah, you burn away the yellow mold, you destroy the portcullis, so you know you circumvent this little uh, barrier here. But that came at a significant risk and a significant cost because there was only one fireball at a very low level that was like their only really good offensive spell, and they paid for it in the final battle because then 3/4 of the party was killed, right? Because they didn't have that fireball to hurt the mummy.
Right. Right.
Um, but also they attempted to disturb the yellow mold, which was the only save or die trap in the adventure. So that's, you know, my approach in general is like if you find that the players are getting pretty high level and super powered, you're playing a game like 5e, try to avoid just shutting it down, but rather go,
Mhm.
okay, this make this the hardest lock possible. So just make
Right.
it very dangerous, make it risky, make it interesting. And what you'll find is, because the reality is, you know, the flow that we're generating here is meant to be interesting, but even when players find ways to short circuit it, that's still fun, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why, you know, that's one of the reasons I started steering more away from 5th edition in general, because I wanted to steer away more from like being a storyteller and being more of a referee. And I feel like a lot of Deathtrap dungeons really lend themselves more to being a referee, not a storyteller. Like the Deathtrap dungeon, like the story at the end is like how the players got through. It's not like, and we're setting like bits and pieces of like some almost like in like lore, but we're not like guiding them through an adventure, like making sure that, you know, they hit the points that we want them to hit. It's more just like, you know, at the end of the day, they're trying to beat this Death Trap dungeon, and if they come up with a good idea on how to beat a hard task, good job them. You know, but that's, you know, I like I said, I do feel like these lend themselves more to systems where DMs or GMs are more referees than storytellers, because I think the dungeon tells the story itself as opposed to trying to tell a story. So I don't feel that if someone gets around something that I have like missed out on like a story beat I needed to tell, you know?
Right. Yeah, because the way the dungeon's set up is it's meant to be like an objective challenge. It's not necessarily meant to be a springboard for collaborative storytelling, right? Although
Right.
your adventure could have elements of that. But rather, like I said in the previous episode, when we're creating Death Trap dungeons, we're taking on a role more similar to a video game level designer
Mhm.
or like a game show producer than a storyteller, right?
Right.
And so what we're
Right.
doing here is we're essentially creating like a Legends of the Hidden Temple obstacle course, or a better
Fuck yeah.
example, and actually, um, the Dark Souls games are a really great example of these kinds of cycles in practice, and that's because Dark Souls draws a lot from the Legend of Zelda, which is what Cyclic Dungeon Generation pulls from as well. It creates these very sort of Zelda feeling dungeons, but even in Dark Souls, a lot of the fun of it is that not every barrier in that game is like straight up like you can't pass. Like there are what are called soft locks.
Right.
And sequence breaking is like a big fun part of the game. Like you can still get some enjoyment. So in the case of like Dark Souls 1, there's this area that you're not really supposed to go to first that you can get to from pretty early in the game. And it doesn't just straight up block you, but there are these very dangerous ghost enemies that you really can't hurt until you find a certain item. If you're really, really good, you could potentially just, you know, run through it and avoid the ghosts and pick up the things that you need. So it's not like a completely hard lock, but it's still very dangerous to do.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
recommend for high level players is look to, those sort of soft locks in games like Dark Souls where, you know, 9 times out of 10, the player is going to be stopped in their tracks when trying to cross this barrier. But, not always. And that can be fun of like, oh shit, like we made it through. Like when my players circumvented the longer loop here. I mean, they knew what they were getting into. They knew, like, they had like a 10-minute conversation about using Fireball. Like, they really agonized over it, which was, one of the moments that we talked about in the previous episode. Like, a big part of the fun of Deathtrap dungeons is deliberation, is strategy, is limited resources. And if the players want to choose to take that risk or choose to burn that limited resource, that's part of the fun. Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And as I said, it's I really feel like it's more referee versus storyteller. A lot of like the critical roleization of fifth edition has really wanted people to put on, kind of like shows and hit those story beats and have story narratives going through. But this is more, as you said, like it's more gamified. Like it's, there's times where with something might be put in front of you and it's not reality simulator, it's a game, so sometimes you don't need an explanation for everything except that it's fucking cool and it fits into what we're doing in this game that we're playing. So not everything has to have something completely set in reality to explain its purpose in the dungeon. Sometimes the purpose can be it's a fun game. So
Right.
yeah.
And one last thing I want to say before we move on. I forget who asked the question. I apologize, but this process generates nonlinear dungeons, and in my experience, the players have always told me that they felt like there was a lot of like paths for them to take. They never felt like they were being hemmed in or railroaded. But I will say that this process is a little bit different from things like straight up, Jaquang the dungeon is that it doesn't create a maximally non-linear experience, right? It creates, in my opinion, just enough choice, good enough choice. I've never felt like the players, were being hemmed in. But that's one thing that I've seen people, talk about as well is, well, is this basically forcing players through a sort of like a railroaded flow chart? But in reality, it actually creates dungeons that feel, like there is choice where you can go, but not overwhelming choice, and that the actual pass through the dungeon feel satisfying because they have these little gameplay flows to them, right?
Well, I mean, the other thing too is, if you do want a little bit of a sense of reality, and human beings will always try to seek patterns in everything that they do. Like that's just literally how the brain works. The other thing too, though, is if there's intention and it's meant to feel like a human created it, a human is, for the most part, not just going to dig random rooms all over the place as non-linear as they possibly can. Whoever or whatever creature created this would still create pathways in which that they could get from point A to point B. They wouldn't make it, unless it's a labyrinth on purpose, it's not necessarily going to be a maze. So having things like loops and pathways through the dungeon makes sense because at some point someone created this to traverse it from a point A to point B that they were trying to get to as well. So
Yeah.
it still gives a sense of purpose and humanity to it if there are pathways and loops and things like that, because you need them to actually traverse a space.
I like that you mentioned that, because in the essay that um, Dr. Dormans has in the procedural generation book, he talks about that being the inspiration for this algorithm, is the fact that in real architecture, um, its cycles are very common, especially with things like parks or city layouts. Architects have known for a very long time that cycles, loops are what make spaces interesting and easy to traverse. So yeah, it's actually, even though I'm very anti-realist, it's actually more realistic to have these things. But anyway, in the last, I don't know, 20 minutes or so that we have here, we won't get through every single room, but I want to start populating some of these chambers. So what we're going to do here is I've got a couple PDFs I threw your way. I think one of them was this random challenge table. Have you got that handy?
I think I do. Give me 1 second. I think that's one of these, right? Let me room challenge table.
Yes.
Yes, there we go. Okay, we are up. Actually, let me kick back to this. Boom, there we go. All right. Room challenge random table. Here we go.
Yeah. So this is something that I put together not too long ago that breaks down a number of different sort of challenge types that rooms in a Deathtrap dungeon might present. So you can see here, we've got a number of them that are familiar, like hard choice, and we talked about that last time. But there's some other things here, like a hidden secret, lock or key, surprise twist, an out-of-depth monster or trap, a lore fragment. Basically, this for me is actually kind of part of the secret sauce, I think, of randomly generating dungeon adventures that feel interesting. Because what this does is it forces every single chamber in the dungeon to have some kind of interesting interaction in it, to not just be an empty room
Right.
or a room with like 2d6 skeletons, but there's some kind of uh, interaction here, some kind of challenge. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to start with this green room here, our start chamber. Basically, we're going to roll here to determine what kind of interesting challenge our first dungeon room is going to present to the players as soon as they arrive. So go ahead and roll for me a D4 and a... Oh, sorry, go on.
Sorry, I had a quick question with that. This is just for like future planning, because we can always tweak this later. Do we have the plan to potentially do that like antechamber with like the 2 NPC situation? Would that be the opening room, or would that maybe be like what could lead to this very first room?
So what we might do, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that we can definitely do with this process is, manually tweak it, do a little post-processing. What I'm thinking is maybe we have the start chamber, and then we have a corridor, like a third path that splits off here. And I think you mentioned you wanted kind of like a little antechamber, and then, like 2 rooms, right? One for each of the NPCs.
Potentially, yeah. You know what it kind of reminds me of is your gosh, there was a part in why am I blanking on, is it the Coiled Crown?
The game book?
Yeah, I think there was maybe I'm completely making this up, but I feel like there was a part in the Coiled Crown where you kind of go into a space and there's like these multiple kind of chambers that you can kind of go into. That vibe is what kind of like popped into my head a little bit about just possibly like having this space that leads to these 2 potential NPCs that like can't see each other, but like you walk into their space and it gives you like the vibe of their space, and you get a little info from this one, you get a little info from that one, and you go, okay, like now I know this is a thing that I can come back to, or that leads me to some type of clue or something.
Yeah, 100%. You might be thinking about the shrine of Urail on the second floor of the keep, where there's like the main chamber that has the Medusa statue, and then
Hmm.
there's two little rooms off to the sides that have pyres in them.
I think maybe something like that. Yeah, it
Yeah,
just the vibe of that is what really like stuck in my head of this, just like the space and these other options to go back to, but you're just like kind of like go in them. You get it's almost like alcovey, and then you can come back to the main thing and keep
yeah,
going as opposed to pathways. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, so what kind of, like I said, this is described in the Cyclic Dungeon PDF too. Like, feel free to add rooms, add connections, embellish the dungeon to your own degree. Provided the overall flow is kept. So we kind of got that in there. So back to this starting chamber here. Go ahead and roll for me a D4 and a D6, and we'll see what kind of challenge pops up.
Okay, so I rolled a 1 and a 3.
Interesting. So this block off a path, retreat, or reward.
That's like the
So
very first.
basically, it's yeah. So you want to re-roll that maybe? You feel you want
I
to do a
don't.
re-roll
Yeah,
on
that
that?
doesn't really. I mean, it kind of doesn't really feel like a very first room. Um, that works well. So I 43 on this one. Fun.
So we got to save or die straight up. Hell yeah! What an opening. Um, yeah. So basically, this first chamber is going to have some kind of challenge,
Hmm.
and the vibe is going to be save or die. Love it.
It could almost be
Um,
like the literal entrance to the dungeon, where you could just be like, "Sorry, you just roll up characters. You just all TPK'd. Bye. Let's
rip.
like try
Yeah.
again." Yeah.
So I'm gonna put the little save or die here,
Hmm.
and then what we're gonna do is roll on the Victory Basic dungeon features table to determine what's actually in this room and potentially what is actually the thing that is causing the saving or the dying. Do you have the victory? I have the thing handy in front of me here. I can go ahead and roll, or if you want to pull it up on screen, what would you prefer?
Just like the core Victory Basic rulebook.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it'd give me like 2 seconds to grab that real quick. Actually, I think I perma have that downloaded. Um, Victory Basic complete rules. Boom, right there. All right. And what page am I going to?
That would be. I have the DM screen in front of me, but it's like it's in book 3. It's towards the end. It'll be called like dungeon features.
So I'm at the complication types of puzzles. Uh-huh. Traps and hazards, dungeon features, 1D100 dungeon features.
Yeah. So why don't
Perfect.
we have somebody in chat roll a D100 for us?
Oh gosh, I don't think I have a D100 as a command.
No, I'll go ahead and roll it. I have
Do
it
you want him to
yeah.
do 2D10s?
Oh, 2D10s will work. Yeah.
Yeah, does someone want to roll D10 twice? So we got a 4. And if someone else wants to roll another D10, exclamation point 1D10, I don't think I have 100. I'll add it for next time. Or whoever just rolls the next exclamation point 1D10, we'll put it together and we'll get our thing here. Oh, there we go. So a 42. Ooh, vegetation or fungi.
Yeah. So before we dive too deep into that, what we want to do with this table, this is like very generic. I'm putting in quotes. Dungeon features.
Mm-hmm.
What we want to do is flavor what we've rolled with our theme. So we've got vegetation or fungi. So how does that fit with our theme? And actually, I'm looking here. Don't we already have like fungus, myconid spider? Like,
We do. So
we want to
this would
move the
be
myconid spider over.
we could so two options. We could move the myconid spider over, or as almost like guarding the entrance to the dungeon kind of thing. Or there could be some type of fungus here that pops up again later as almost if like it's traveled through the earth to that later space that we were talking about in the moisture area. So those are the two options that popped into my head. But it's like if we don't want to repeat something, I would say we could just move like the whole Mike and its spider over right to the beginning of the dungeon, where almost as if like the would this be like the very first room, or could this almost be like the entrance kind of thing is what popped into my head, or even like the entrance is like broken down because the fungus has like torn it down and the spider is just like living in this kind of like first room entrance chamber kind of thing.
See, that's what I like. I was thinking like there was this transition between the normal world, like the above ground world, and the Tomb of the Corroded Goddess. We have this intro area where basically this myconid spider set up its nest here. And so the way the players get into the dungeon, first they got to deal with the myconid spider that's responsible for breaking down the walls. And the myconid spider has some kind of save or die effect, because that's kind of the that's the highlight of this particular room is, oh god, there's a save or die here.
Well, what if it's like straight up like if you get bit, like you save or you like turn into a mushroom person?
Love it. And I like your idea. See, this goes back to our death episode where we want to try to embellish the death. So it's not just a save or die. It's not just, oh, I failed my poison save and now I'm dead. Here's what I'm thinking. The myconid spider, save or die, and then those, I don't know why I'm writing like this. Those who, God, make it wider, please. Here we go. Those who fail to save get digested into the whole giant fungus root system. You know what I'm talking about?
My
the root
God,
systems can go.
Yeah. Well, so how about what about have you seen Annihilation?
No, but you've told me about it.
Okay, so there's a scene where this person gets like is in like a pool, like a swimming pool, but they're like against the wall, and it takes a second to realize that it's basically turned into like a fungusy thing. What if, especially because this might be a situation where players can come in and out of the dungeon if they really need to, right?
Yeah.
What if like if a player dies in that first room, every time they come in and out, they see that player like fungused into all of the fungus that's in the room, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like every time they go in, it's like more fungusy until it's like unrecognizable.
I love it. And then part of it too is, I'm thinking sort of how do we instrumentalize this? I wrote here, those that fail to save get digested into the whole giant fungus root system. Future fungus enemies gain a benefit depending on the victim's traits, right?
Oh.
So let's say, for example, this is off the top of my head, you're playing like 5e version of this or something, and I don't remember if there's still Eladrin or not, like the elves that can teleport,
I mean, there are now.
Yeah, because they were in 4th edition. I like them. But essentially imagine like, okay, the Eladrin is the one that gets bitten and digested, decomposed into the fungus system. Okay, now later when they encounter, let's say, like the myconid spider male who's kind of made his web here, and then we have the bigger female over here, right, that's guarding the sarcophagus. It's got some powers based on the decomposed dungeoneer. So maybe, okay, now this myconid spider has like the Eladrin teleportation power. You know what I'm saying?
I gotcha. And not only that, even for flavor, what popped into my head too was maybe some of the either like the underlings or even the bossing itself actually has like the ability to have like either the face and or voice. I was
thinking that too. Yeah.
Oh man,
how creepy would that be? Yeah,
that'd be so again, watch Annihilation, dude. But I love that idea that like they were attached to the fungus earlier at the beginning, and then later, their literal face or their voice or their something is right off the bat. And whatever ability that they might have rolled for their character to start, like, love that.
Yeah, 100%.
Or even like if it's the fighter that dies, like maybe there's like, with the spider, with the female spider later, maybe there's a couple of little small baddies that are like little mushroomy things but have that character's face, and they have like the fighter ability, like you just said, like they're fighters, but if it's the caster, then they cast spells and stuff like that. I love that. So dope.
As you can see,
and it
here,
gives us a weird kind of like it fits in a weird way part of the dungeon too, where it's a lot of like rust and corrosion and stuff like that. But then you go, oh, like fungus or decay too. Like it's a
Yeah.
cool little like other kind of like little farther out part of the theme.
Yeah. And I want to pause here for a second and just, hopefully people are able to see the value of these different, processes that we've been talking about throughout the stream series. Like we just came up with in what, like 5 minutes, this what I think is a really interesting, engaging thematic interaction here, almost entirely like randomly generated. Like we just had, okay, we had these elements we came up with earlier, like the Myconid spider. We have our little dungeon room challenge thing. Like, okay, it was a save or die. We talked about death in the previous episode. Like, hey, how do we take death and not just have it be, well, the player character dies, but it has some other effect, right? Like it gets worse was I think one of the moments that we talked about. Like, we've made it so it's really, really easy and fun to come up with interesting dungeon elements without having to put a whole lot of work. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and not only that, like we talked about moments last episode, and you can't tell me that at the end of the dungeon, people aren't going to be like, "Oh my god, remember when dude's face was on that fucking spider?"
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
know?
100%. And I don't want to seem like I'm shitting on things like, donjon or random tables. Like I think
Shit,
they have their
shit
value.
away,
I'm
shit
not I'm not much
away.
of a shitter honor, but
I'm a shitter on her. I'll say that.
but I feel like this is something that it'd be very unlikely that you would come up with something like this using those random generation tables, right? Like if we were
Right.
just simply rolling, you know, okay, we have this rectangle here and it's got 3 exits and there's a giant spider. Like, maybe a sufficiently experienced or creative GM could, potentially roll up elements and then see a connection and embellish it a little bit. But, it's like I mentioned up top at the start of the episode. Um, the sentiment that was expressed in the procedural generation book that I happen to agree with, which is there's a difference between a system that consistently allows you to come up with these really interesting, engaging interactions and a purely random system where you have to sort of hope that every once in a while maybe something really compelling will arise out of it.
Mm.
So why don't we do maybe one more? So why
Okay.
don't we do the antechamber here between the two NPCs? Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's well, do we want that to be is the are now my question with that is I in my head consider that almost like not a sanctum, but like a space that they could come back to get to these NPCs like with a corpse body and have it almost be like a little like that's where like the story quote unquote beat is a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But would we potentially have this as some type of like trap or thing like that, or this? To me, it felt like this is like the vibe space,
Sure.
where we set like a tone between these two NPCs. But you feel like this is another space where we would put one of these other guys.
I mean, normally I try to put like a challenge in every room, but you know what? I'm good with that. Just keeping that, just vibes. Um, so why don't we then jump over to this room down here? Or you know what we should do? Let's do this one. The one that we drew out here with our exposed. I don't have the Myconid spider already. All right, let's do the start of the cycle down here where they can see.
Love it, love it.
So oops, I don't want to do that. So I'm gonna go ahead and erase really quick little diagram down here and try to draw out like a really, really roughed out. So I don't want green, I want you. So we have kind of they enter, there's like a crack in the wall, and that's where they see out to, here. And then we've got a door there, I suppose. Um, so we're determining what is in this chamber where the
Right.
players will come down and they can see out through the crack in the wall. So why don't we have you
Chat.
go ahead and roll for me on the room challenge table again?
Do you want me to roll? Or you want chat to roll this one up?
Chat can roll if they feel up to it. I don't know
Yeah,
how many
go for it.
people have
Someone just roll
possibilities.
a estimation point D4 and then an estimation point D6 from somebody else. Ooh, a 1 on the D4. We just need that other estimation point D6 and we'll take that. And we got a 6, a 1 and a 6.
Awesome. Oh, so this one is a time or a turn limit.
Ooh,
So this chamber, there is something, some kind of challenge, some kind of danger that imposes a time or a turn limit.
interesting.
So the next thing we're gonna do, I'm gonna write down really quick down here, time turn limit. Go ahead and roll for me a d20. We're gonna determine what the room contents are.
Ooh, we got an 18.
So that's a special. Interesting.
Oh,
So
hitting this
typically,
hard.
yeah, the way that I do specials in Victory Basic is that each one is keyed to an ability score. So it's
Mm-hmm.
some in Victory Basic specifically, a special is like, okay, it's a some kind of dungeon feature that allows a player character to make a roll with a specific ability score, and depending on what they roll, there's some kind of other effect, right? And it could be positive or negative. So go ahead and roll me a d6 to determine what ability score it's going to key off of.
1.
That's strength. So
Nope.
there's some kind of like weird thing in this room. So weird special that involves a strength roll, right? And that this thing is gonna have a it's gonna time return limit. It's gonna be related to that in some way. We'll figure out how in a second. So the last thing I want you to do for me, you can do it or chat can do it. I need another D100 for the actual terrain.
Let's go ahead and do a D100 because I can just roll a D100.
Sure.
35.
That is a statue.
Ooh, we just created the the statue room.
Yeah, we
um,
recreated it.
yeah.
So what we have here, these are our elements that we're going to be working with, our ingredients for this room, is that there's a statue in the middle. We can determine what it is actually of, and we got to make it thematic. The players can interact with it by making a strength roll, and this will relate to some kind of time or turn limit, right? So what's popping out to you right now?
Well, we do have the statue that's gonna burn everybody. I do like the idea of potentially, they see statue, they walk in, they go, okay, we wrestle this one. They see another statue later and go, okay, we just have to do the same thing in this one, and boom, they get fucking corroded into nothingness. You know what I mean? It's almost like they think they know what's gonna happen and it's completely different kind of thing. But what could they do with a statue in the room that also lets them see across the chasm or whatever?
Yeah.
Um,
Here's what I'm thinking because we got our ingredients already simmering on the pot. I'm looking up at the top here, top right. We have erosion.
mhm.
So my feeling is the players arrive here, right? They look out through the crack. And when they do so, they'll see that, the liquid, the ash is pouring down and it threatens to erode the sarcophagus within, I don't know, let's say 30 minutes of real time, right?
Okay.
And they can interact with this statue using strength to potentially maybe slow down, speed up, or do something to, affect the rate at which the sarcophagus is eroding away.
So I immediately go to like some type of valve situation.
Yeah, I like it.
Um. So what? I wonder what we could like. What would the statue be connected to that would what? So we have the cliff, we have this crack, we have this like lake, and somehow like lower down because we decided we're kind of going down, potentially even like looping under the lake and coming back around to it. We have it connected to something that's allowing water to erode away a space. What if? Oh, okay. What if it's another statue
We're here.
that yeah, what if it's potentially another statue that is like almost more like a fountain kind of? So like the water is like
Oh,
pouring
yeah.
out of it, and like as you rotate the one statue, you'll rotate the other. So
Yeah.
it's almost like you turn off the water over there, but that could also make the water turn on over here too, potentially in
Oh,
going
I like
forward.
it.
But basically it could be like linked statues, and the space across the chasm is similar to the room you're in now, but a ton of it's eroded away because the water is on, and
Yeah.
that is actually exposed the room beneath, and that's why you can see the sarcophagus, but it's still eroding away the sarcophagus too, and you have to turn it off, and maybe turning the one
Yeah.
statue will turn the other statue.
And then where the strength roll comes in something like a Powered by the Apocalypse system is okay, you can roll plus strength on a 10 plus, and I'm picturing I've been like looking at this statue on top of the sarcophagolem,
Yeah.
that maybe it's like the priestess, right? A statue like an rusted iron statue of her, and you like have to pull down one of her arms by rolling plus strength. On a 10 plus you're successful, and it shuts off the time limit, right? Or slows it down considerably. Okay, now instead of 30 minutes you have an hour. If you get, a 7 to 9, all right, you're able to slow down the process of erosion by shutting off this valve or raising a dam or event somewhere. Um, but there's some other complication we can come up with a little bit later. And then I'm thinking, like, okay, if you roll a 6 or less, you just completely break the arm off. And not only do you not stop the flow, but you fuck something else up, and now it's going quicker. Now you have 15 minutes to get over there.
Interesting. My only
That's what the
question,
tricks are like,
yeah,
is you've got
my only question with
positive and
that
negative.
is if they fail, are we potentially like it's a big deal, like it's a thing, but are we potentially like taking out like a really important part of the dungeon if it destroys the sarcophagus?
We could.
Or
I mean,
would
that's
they
something that I did in
still somebody did what?
in a tournament dungeon. I am not shy about, because really the game ends when the time limit runs out, really.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if the players screw up and a puzzle item gets destroyed, well, then they're kind of fucked and they lose out on those points. But the adventure continues, right? To the things to do, because really it's like the goal is to get the most points, not necessarily to finish the adventure. So
Right,
there's
right, right,
still
right,
value
right.
in doing it. But also, I mean, you could make it where, okay, the erosion doesn't necessarily destroy the artifact, but maybe makes it more perilous, right? So let's say, oh,
True,
it's,
true, 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 true.
you know what I mean? Like, we don't have to be like black and white, like it's either it's destroyed or
Right,
it's
right, right, right.
there.
I love the idea of that. I also, it's interesting too because we the thought, a couple of thoughts that I have with it are, one is, yeah, like pull the arm down, because then you could actually like almost choreograph it. So like the arms are down on that statue and up on this one. So
Yeah, I
you
love it.
almost like you have to pull them down and you'll see the other ones raise up, or in some way like turn it. And I feel like we could almost put in like a potential advantage for them if they actually like, okay, we have 30 minutes, let's see what's in the next room. Or, you know what I mean? If they're willing to try to like maybe push forward to see if they could find something that will help them, and maybe they
Yeah.
could. Maybe if they're turning it, maybe there's like a pole or something for leverage, or something that allows them to get that a little bit easier, and we could even like put it behind like another situation, right? Where like maybe there's like a potential trap or something, and then when they get that item, they go, "Oh shit, this is actually going to help us in the last room." They run back, they plug it in, and it helps them turn it, and they get like advantage on the roll or something. That's kind of like what was popping in my head with those two options. Basically, like have the have to match the statue's position to see it switch back, or rotate it to face the same thing, kind of.
Mm-hmm. I'm just drawing little notes here to myself. One of the things we can do as well, I always like adding sort of multiple layers of complication to things.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the myconid spider. One of the thoughts that I had was that the spider doesn't love the eroding liquid that's pouring into this chamber here. And so it fights at a disadvantage if the players decide to not try to shut the water off or shut the acid off.
Interesting.
But if they do, and this is something you telegraphed, I'm like, okay, you can just proceed as normal. You're going to have 30 minutes to get over there before the erosion reaches its full effect. But, the spider is going to be kind of at half strength or something because it doesn't like the eroding liquid that's pouring through. But if you shut the valve off and that eroding liquid dries up, the myconid spider is going to unstretch her legs and she's going to be tougher to fight. So you've got like these two different variables you're trying to weigh,
The other thing too, though, is like, yeah, if you only have like the 30 minutes, you don't know how many rooms are between you and that space.
Right. Yeah.
And if they fuck around, they're gonna find out.
Oh yeah. So like I said, I mean, we're only kind of making a dent into the overall layout, but I'm hoping for both you and the people who are watching that it kind of makes sense what we've done here tonight is
Yeah.
we've created kind of the high level structure of the dungeon, creating what is hopefully a space that is non-linear enough where it's fun to explore, but also has a feeling of progression, of drama, of interesting sort of handcrafted feeling uh, areas. And then we're essentially then just pouring our stuff from the previous lessons right into this mold here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is, I mean, the fact that we created, not only did we start with this fungus spider area that was going to delineate between like real life and not real life, but like the space outside the crypt and inside the crypt. It pops up again later, and now we're having it pop up again in this situation in the very next part, potentially, because we've tied that back into this whole water erosion aspect. Like it all ties in so well. Someone in chat said earlier, like that it's what do they say? It's a bit weird how easy it feels to just like plug all this in and have it just make sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's really what it's about. And we come back to it every episode, but the idea is we're not having to sit and twiddle our thumbs and be like, okay, well, now what do we do? Or try to freestyle it. Like we're designing with intention. That's something I like to say. We're mindfully designing. Where at every point in the process, we kind of know what needs to happen next, and we're doing things in a way that are going to help us meet our game design goals.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so any last words, either from you or in the chat before we kind of wrap it up and do our plugs and preview the next episode?
I mean, I'm good here. I love what we're doing here. I feel like they're like, I'm excited to get to the point where we're just like tweaking at the end, because I feel like we have 2 sarcophaguses here, but what kept popping into my head was potentially 4 bones at the beginning for 4 player characters. And then if one gets stuck into the sarcophagolem to set that off, there's 3 left. So I'm really curious where we're going to maybe potentially tuck in like the last sarcophagus before the final boss, even if that's like the last one that like triggers it or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's kind of popping into my head. And I think that, I love how we incorporated, like I said, like I kind of wanted the sarcophagus to be in different spaces, and it's like, okay, well, each loop gets one, and it worked out really, really well.
Yeah.
And then, just God, like the spider is great, but like triggering the sarcophagolem like from that first loop feels so good for this whole process.
Yeah, and if you're an
Uh,
especially cruel GM, like I'm already picturing a situation that comes up where the players are like, "Oh shit, okay, we have 30 minutes to make our way around to get to this other sarcophagus. So let's book it." They go here and they go here, and then of course the sarcophagus just comes, this
yep.
way. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of what it's all
Yeah.
about is creating the conditions for these really interesting, engaging moments. And for me, if I was the GM, I would just fudge that and be like, "Oh shit, look who's here!"
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. That's great.
Playing with no
I
defense.
also I also like the idea that what popped right into my head right away too is that if they're if they have to flee the sarcophagolem right off the bat, what if like when it wakens up, like it comes down to whether we want them to have to find the true goal later or whether they're just like, oh shit, what if like when they wake up and they're like kind of like smashing stuff, it like opens like a crack in the wall or whatever, or like it kind of like breaks something down a little bit and they see that other path. So
Oh, that's cool.
they would literally have to almost awaken the sarcophagolem to like kind of find that space that opens to like the quote unquote
Yeah.
true goal. And it also gives them another area to flee. And then once they leave the room, the sarcophagolem just goes okay and just starts like walking around through the spaces now.
Yeah.
I love this. This is so good.
And that was a really good idea because I'm a big fan of finding interesting ways to connect chambers beyond just like doors and tunnels. Like anytime like a monster or trap can cause new paths to be created in the dungeon is always a lot of fun. So I always, yeah, that's a really cool idea of the sarcophagus being the thing that breaks open the path to the true goal. Um, awesome. Anything from chat, or are we ready to do our plugs and talk about our
Oh,
next episode?
I think we're good. I mean, Chad has been super, super supportive. We really appreciate everyone being here every time to do the roles and to be invested in it. So, thanks to the people that are often here. We really appreciate it. Yeah, I think that's. I think we're just a little past time, so that's about where I'm at. So Sersa, where we talked about Sick Like Dungeon a lot. We're using the Victory basic features. Where can people find this stuff?
Yeah, so all of these things can be grabbed for free at itch.io/Sersa Victory. If you also do !Sersa in chat, you should see my link tree, and all that stuff is linked there. There's also links to my Dungeon 23 content. I put up the January module already. It's a basic expert module, and then the next one for February should be up in a few days. So definitely follow me if you want to get notified when that comes up. If you're into writing Gothic fiction, I just put out a new online course through Storytelling Collective called Write Your First Gothic Romance. That is also linked from my link tree. And yeah, pretty much I really, really padded the link tree out with more stuff. So pretty
Oh
much
yeah.
anything that you'd want to find that I've been doing, you can get from there.
That's what's up. Yeah, pop that up. There's a lot of stuff here. Well, it's because Circe's done a lot. Definitely check out the link tree and see all the stuff they've done, especially if you're into 5e. Again, the Necropolis of the Mailed Fist as a module is one of the things that made me go, huh, there's other ways to play this game, and has really, really led me in many different ways to where we are today, considering it's also how I was able to get in contact and meet Sersa in the first place. So highly recommend, if you do still play 5e, to check those out, and everything that Sersa makes is well worth your time, your money, and your thoughts. So check out all that stuff. And we are the Adventure Archive here. I don't know if we talked about last time. We recently did a rebrand. Love the new logo. Jason and Jess did a great job. Check that out. Check us out on YouTube at the Adventure Archive. We're on Twitter at wait, pick back to here. Oh, I don't have the links at ADVNTR archive because they don't give you enough letters. And that's where we're at. And you can also check us out here on the Adventure Archive on the Weekly Scroll is something I do often, where I review myself and Hunter review and read through tabletop role-playing games and interview the creators that make them. So that is us here at the Adventure Archive. That is Sersa Victory, and that is our episode for today. What are we doing next week?
So next week on Seance, we are going to discuss monster design. So we've got our moments, we've got our unique mechanic, our little papercraft bone collection, our theme. So the next we're gonna do is we're gonna zoom in, and we'll probably end up doing the sarcophagolem and
I'm so
designing
stoked
that
for that.
and talking about that. But one thing, I have homework for you for next time.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah, absolutely.
So for next episode, what I would like for you to do is decide what game system we're going to use, because we're going to create an actual stat block, our first actual stat block next episode.
I mean, we already know what system this is going to be in.
Do we?
Oh, why would I do anything besides Victory Basic for this?
See, I don't know. I actually tend to shy away because I don't know how many people really play it.
I mean, we're not doing 5e, so I mean the options for me, if we're talking about homework, it's homework. Yeah. So let's talk about it, and we'll do it for next time.
That's right. All right.
Yeah.
I think that's it, folks.
Cool. That's our episode. That is Seance, episode 5. That is mapping. Next week, as we said, it's monsters. Again, appreciate everyone listening. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening on podcast, because at some point I will get this to podcast, we always appreciate it. So you guys have a wonderful night, and we will see you next week. Same time, 7 Pacific, here on the Adventure Archive. Have a good one.
Thanks, folks.